Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, October 16th, 2021, and today I'm going to be taking a look at 538's new tracker that tracks congressional members and how often they vote in line with President Joe Biden across various states, with every single United States Senator and House of Representatives member plotted onto one overall grid. In today's video, as you can tell from the title of it, that we are going to be solely focusing on the United States Senate, primarily speaking because we are looking at a lot of outcry from the left wing, primarily towards these Democratic senators for not voting in line with Joe Biden a lot of the time. In addition, you have seen a lot of criticism, specifically on Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema, but this tracker might actually prove that they don't seem to be as against the Joe Biden administration as one might expect if you read the reports from the media or members of the left wing. Now, I'm not one to try to make an argument in favor or against Kyrsten Sinema or Joe Manchin in terms of how they vote, but I do also want to just say that this Biden Congress vote tracker doesn't exactly pick everything up that it needs to. You are looking at a congressional situation in which by the time we reach the actual vote, sure, Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin could come along, but at the end of the day, there are, of course, a lot of things that were held up primarily before the vote, and that needs to be addressed as well. So this tracker is not a perfect science. It may change your opinion on the way that you view Sinema and Joe Manchin's voting record, or it may not. You just need to take everything into consideration, and I do want to say that you can certainly find some pros and cons against all of these people, even besides Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, when it comes down to the way that they vote and the way that they decide to represent their state in the United States Senate. Now, we haven't had much time in Congress, to be completely honest with you. This will likely be much more beneficial to look at by the time we reach the 2022 congressional cycle. It is not often that members of the incumbent party vote against their own president, and also because this is a tracker as to how much people agree with Joe Biden or not, there are going to be votes in which every single political party member will vote in line with Joe Biden. That's why there are no Republicans at 0%, but there are plenty of Democrats at 100%. Joe Biden has taken many bipartisan positions on certain bills, and Republicans have voted with the Democratic Party on certain things. It's not everything, but there are occasions in which they just decide to pass things that have no real impact on the national electorate or on an individual electorate when it comes down to swing states, and those are the things you will start to see sort of be pushed out there into that 10-20% when you see Republicans voting with Joe Biden a fifth of the time. It doesn't mean necessarily that they side with him a fifth of the time. It just means that Joe Biden took a position that was universally agreed upon. Now, doing a little bit of a flashback, that is the approval rating, not the tracking Congress and age of Trump. Here's the tracking Congress and age of Trump. You can see that by the time we reach the final numbers here, that the highest a member of Congress had voted with President Trump in terms of someone who lasted during the entire 4 years of his presidency or longer than just a little bit, you will see here that the Trump score was 100% for just two people, two Republican senators from Alabama, neither of which served more than a year into Donald Trump's term or the final year of Donald Trump's term. The highest we have seen during the time period in which you have a senator that was in office at the same time as Donald Trump being elected was when you take a look at David Perdue. He voted with Donald Trump 94% of the time. He was reelected back in 2014, elected for the first time in 2014. So he was actually in a Senate race there in 2020. He ended up losing, but he served during the entire time of Joe Biden's presidency. He actually ended up leaving right after Donald Trump, right around the time period of the insurrection. Never got to say a goodbye speech on the United States Senate floor because he was forced to retire simply by the fact that his term was up. But you can see pretty much that the highest you will see for a Trump score among senators who served throughout the entirety of President Trump's term is 94%. And then when you get to the lowest point, it actually is just 20% when it comes down to those who are actually are 12%. The same way you are looking at the Joe Biden numbers, and you can see that there are members of Congress that match with Joe Biden around 11%. Even senators such as Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz can't really avoid these positions when Joe Biden takes one that is universally accepted, which means that they would likely have had to vote against their own party if they were to justify Joe Biden when it comes down to this Biden tracker here. But this is a very good tracker that I think that we are going to be using for the foreseeable future and for just a very long time. The way that members of Congress vote is always super important when it comes down to voting by party line and when it comes down to the loyalty of individual members of Congress. It has been, I think, widely accepted that Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema are amongst the more defective Democrats, but by this voting record, they actually aren't. You can actually sort by the Biden score in terms of the members of Congress on the Democratic side that have voted with Joe Biden the most, and most senators have voted with him 100% of the time. Now, there are not many votes in here, and it does make sense that many of them are at 100% this early on into his first term. It is going to be, or only term, not entirely sure yet, but we are looking at the countless senators in the 100%, and you might be surprised to see some of these names that are going to be and continuously are scrutinized in the American media and by members of the left wing, even those in the United States Senate. For instance, Joe Manchin from West Virginia has a 100% Joe Biden voting record. Now, we know that Joe Manchin certainly has been against Joe Biden on a number of endeavors, specifically in the United States Senate and in terms of his own personal endeavors. Joe Manchin is largely appealing to that solid Republican base in the state of West Virginia. And I think that he is trying to run for re-election in 2024 and is doing anything he can to separate himself from the non-West Virginia Democrat type of idea. As soon as he's tied to Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, he can't win re-election. So he does push back, especially when you see a lot of people in the media up in arms against him because of this pushback. But once it actually comes down to voting, Joe Manchin has not voted against the Democratic Party. There have been circumstances where you have seen nominations that have already been cut short because they simply don't have the votes, meaning the vote was never held, or you will have things that are scrapped entirely just because the Democratic Party can't reach a vote. For instance, when it comes down to Joe Biden's position on 51st state, Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico statehood, certain things like that, Joe Biden might take a different position than Joe Manchin, but because of the filibuster, it will never actually reach a vote. But I think it's just fascinating that even amongst the votes that have reached it, that Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema both rank amongst some of the higher ones in terms of the way they have voted with Joe Biden. They match the 100% Joe Biden voting record that we see in the majority of Democratic senators. Very few Democratic senators actually remain below a pretty high threshold. The only Democrat who isn't even really a Democrat, and I say that because he identifies as an independent, the only member of the United States Senate that has voted with Joe Biden less than 97.1% of the time that identifies with the Democratic Party is Senator Bernie Sanders from the state of Vermont. He has voted with Joe Biden 94.1% of the time. He's an independent who caucuses with the Democratic Party, but every single other United States senator, Maryland, Washington, New York, Massachusetts, Oregon, Montana even. These are states that are less left-leaning than the state of Vermont. All of these senators are less than 100%, but 97.1% in favor of Joe Biden's agenda, and that honestly is quite surprising to see Bernie Sanders so low. In addition, there are a number of Republicans actually that are above 50% in terms of how often they have voted with the Joe Biden position. It starts with Mike Crapo in the state of Idaho, Todd Young in the state of Indiana, Roger Wicker in Mississippi, Ron Johnson, Bill Cassidy, Deb Fischer, up, and up until you reach Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, who sort of break that pretty high threshold with three senators, actually Rob Portman as well, above 75%. Susan Collins from Maine, Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, and Rob Portman from the state of Ohio. Rob Portman is retiring in 2022. Susan Collins just won re-election, and Lisa Murkowski has yet to decide whether or not she is going to be running in these midterm elections. So these senators likely have the least to worry about. Mitt Romney also won back in 2018. He is from Utah. He is adored across that state. He is in a good position and does not need to worry much. These are the only senators that are above 70% in terms of how often they have voted with Joe Biden's agenda. But the fact that a Democrat, and Republicans can be in some type of similar range when it comes down to this vote is quite interesting, and I do expect it to change by the time we reach the 2022 election season. But I mean, when you take a look at these Biden margins, you are looking at certain senators that represent states which Joe Biden did not even come close to winning. West Virginia, Donald Trump won with 69% of the vote across the state, with Joe Biden at 30%. Not a single county went blue in 2020 in the state of West Virginia. If you go to 2018, however, Joe Manchin won that state. As a Democrat, he won about half the counties across the state, won with 50% of the vote, and ultimately defeated the Attorney General at the time by around 4 points. And I think that is overly very much impressive for the Democratic Party in the state of West Virginia. And it also might show why there is that initial, I guess, apprehension against Joe Biden in terms of his more liberal endeavors, in terms of his more progressive policy that you might not have seen from Joe Biden during the primary season or during the presidency of Barack Obama. But I think that Joe Manchin even being in that 100% column really says something about his loyalty in a sense to the Democratic Party. I don't think that Joe Manchin should get a free pass per se from members of the left wing who expect him to vote a certain way, but when you take a look at the state's electoral history, you could have predicted this, and I certainly mentioned this multiple times. When Joe Manchin was reelected in 2018, I constantly mentioned that largely this was because he had not voted with the Democratic agenda a lot of the time. When you take a look at tracking Congress in the age of Trump, based off the Trump score, the highest Democrat ranking here that remained in office during the entirety of Donald Trump's 4 years was Joe Manchin. And that was 50.4% of the time. The majority Joe Manchin was in office, the majority of the time that Donald Trump was there, Joe Manchin was voting in favor of his agenda. Same thing with Kyrsten Sinema, except she was elected back in 2018, so she didn't even get to have a full 4 years there with Donald Trump. However, Joe Manchin absolutely did. So when you see that and you sort of understand and put it into perspective why Joe Manchin has voted this way, it makes it even more impressive, I would say, in a sense, that he has voted with the Democratic Party in such a high level. But again, I expect this to change. I don't think this is going to be the exact same. I certainly do not think that a good amount of senators on the GOP side, over 10 of them, nearly 20 actually, will remain in the 50% plus column for Joe Biden. America has only gotten more polarized, and Republican senators have no advantage trying to be that type of bipartisan senator. When you take in the senator, for instance, Tom Cotton in Arkansas, one of the more Republican states across the South, voted for Donald Trump by nearly 30 points. When you see a state like that and you are representing a state like that, you do not want to go back to those constituents and say, I voted with Joe Biden 70% of the time. These Republicans, whether they agree with Biden or not, are likely going to end up turning on him, and there still may be that silver lining there in terms of the amount of seats that have been, the amount of times that Josh Hawley, Ted Cruz, Rick Scott, Tom Cotton, etc. have voted with Joe Biden. You know, it is going to be something that is going to sort of move further down just because they do not want to return to their constituents with a high level. But Tom Cotton actually was at 20% in terms of the Biden voting score, but that probably will go down given how outspoken he is against the president of the United States. But for instance, I mean, Mitch McConnell, the Republican minority leader here, is at 62.9%. I mean, 63% in terms of his voting record is quite impressive for the Democratic Party. Obviously, it is not super important. It is not enough for me to say that this all of a sudden means that the Democratic policy agenda is more popular, that Joe Biden is more popular. This just goes to show that there is some type of bipartisanship in a sense, and also just show you the fact that Democrats have very high numbers, especially those who might not necessarily be or expected to be on that list that are on the list, and it might be somewhat of an eye-opening experience. Again, I'm not trying to say this to persuade you or to push you against whatever type of idea or notion that you have about these senators, but I do want you to make your own informed decision based off of a tracker such as this, and actually circle back in about a year from now or half a year from now. I mean, you can set a reminder, screenshot what you see right now, and compare it in 6 months. It probably will be very interesting, to be completely honest with you, if you are comparing the former votes versus 6 months from now. Because as we get into the more competitive election cycle, as it becomes a more advantageous move for Republicans to stick with their own agenda and for Democrats to stick with a more conservative agenda if they come from states such as Montana or Arizona or Georgia or West Virginia, whatever it might be, Democrats might be trying to position themselves in such a way that they can return to their constituents and say, okay, I might have voted with the Democratic Party a good amount of the time, but I also voted against them and I throttled them, and I think that's what the main moves are right now for Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, considering the states that they come from. Looking at a lot of these senators, they may be worried because you also have senators such as Sherrod Brown, who is sharing a Senate seat here with two senators from Ohio, one Republican, one Democrat. Well, Sherrod Brown won by about 7 points across the state of Ohio. In the 2016 presidential election, Donald Trump won that state by nearly 10 points. In 2020, Donald Trump won it by 9 points. The state of Ohio has never really been super favorable in favor of the Democratic Party after Donald Trump. The governor's election was still lost by 4 points, but Sherrod Brown was a silver lining in which Democrats were able to win a Senate race there, and they were probably very happy about that, to say the least. Jim Renacki, however, I do want to point out, barely barely campaigned in this race, and the fact that he came very close is very telling about the electoral future of the state of Ohio. So I think that also beyond Kyrsten Sinema, beyond Joe Manchin, we are going to start to see some Democratic senators begin to flop and move away from Joe Biden. I think they are going to try to avoid to utter his name when it comes down to campaigning in certain states that might not necessarily like Joe Biden. And when it comes down to voting record, that is a very important thing, and that's why I wholeheartedly expect many of these numbers to drop. But I did want to say now that 538 has it, it holds a lot of information and will be a very good tool to use as we move into the future. Keep your eye on it. It will be just as important and just as crucial as understanding, Senate and House under the age of Trump versus Biden. I think it will be just very important to keep your eyes looking out for this and pretty much monitoring how each senator votes, because that is a very important tool to understand your representative, your senator, and just see how they are responding to a lot of the national implications and how they are directly responding to the popularity of Joe Biden and his policies. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.